The horse was standing in her yard before the sun had even decided to rise. Clara Whitmore had lived on that patch of dry Texas land for 8 years, and nothing, not stray cattle, not drifting travelers, not even the wind that came screaming off the plains in March, had ever crossed her fence without her knowing it first. Yet there it was at dawn, a tall bay gelding with a dark mane hanging loose over its eyes, no saddle, no brand she could see, just a worn leather cord resting against its neck like it belonged to another time. The sky was still bruised purple in the east, the air cold enough to sting her lungs, maybe 40 degrees at most, and the only sound was the slow creak of her porch boards as she stepped out with a tin cup of coffee warming her hands. The horse didn't startle. It didn't back away. It simply watched her, steady and patient, as if it had been waiting for her and not the other way around. Clara knew horses the way some folks knew scripture. She could tell a lame step at 50 yards, could read fear in the twitch of an ear, could sense when a storm was coming by the way a mare shifted her weight. This one wasn't frightened. It wasn't lost in the usual way. Its coat was brushed clean of burrs, its hooves trimmed within the last month, and its ribs didn't show hunger. Someone had cared for this animal. Someone had let it go. She set the coffee down on the porch rail and walked forward, boots pressing into the frost-hardened dirt. "Easy now," she said softly, though the horse had given her no reason to be cautious. The leather cord around its neck caught her eye. Old, cracked, tied in a simple knot that looked handmade. There was no tag, no mark, nothing to claim ownership. Beyond her pasture fence, the land rolled out in wide, empty acres, mesquite trees scattered like tired sentries, the nearest neighbor a good 3 miles down the road. Nobody around here mislaid a horse without riding out half the county to get it back. Clara reached out and laid her palm against the animal's neck. Warm, solid, real. The gelding lowered its head just slightly, as if acknowledging her touch. And then, without any jerk or warning, it turned its body toward the north trail that led past her well and out toward the dry creek bed. It took one step, then another, stopping only when she didn't follow. Clara felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't felt since before the drought took her husband and left her alone with more silence than a body should have to carry. The horse wasn't wandering. It was waiting for her to choose whether she would stay in the safety of her routine or step into a path she had long ago promised herself she'd never walk again. The sun's first thin line of light broke over the horizon, spilling gold across the pasture, and the gelding's shadow stretched long and narrow across the ground, pointing north like an arrow. Clara tightened her shawl against the cold and looked toward that trail, toward land most folks in Red Hollow pretended didn't exist anymore. Then she picked up the lead rope hanging by her barn door, stepped down from the porch, and followed the horse into the waking light. The north trail had not felt the weight of her boots in years, yet it remembered her all the same. The dirt there was packed hard, lined with wagon ruts long faded by sun and wind, and the mesquite branches leaned low as if trying to hide what lay beyond them. The gelding moved ahead at an even pace, never pulling, never straying, only glancing back now and then to make sure she was still there. Clara kept her hand loosely around the lead rope, though she had the sense the rope was more for her comfort than the horse's. The morning air warmed by slow degrees, climbing past 50 as the sun lifted higher, burning away the last of the frost that clung to the grass. Red Hollow sat quiet behind her, smoke just beginning to rise from chimneys in the distance, unaware that she had stepped beyond the border of routine that had defined her life for nearly a decade. She passed the old windmill half a mile out, its blades frozen in place, and felt the first flicker of recognition stir inside her. Few folks rode this way anymore, not since the Harper place had fallen silent. The name surfaced in her mind like something long buried beneath still water. Harper. Elias Harper had owned the land north of the dry creek bed, had built his house from cedar beams hauled in by wagon, had once stood in the middle of town with his hat tipped low and his voice steady, insisting on something most people did not want to hear. Clara remembered how quickly a town could turn when pride mixed with fear. She had kept her head down back then, had chosen survival over questions, and the choice had followed her ever since like a shadow at sundown. The gelding slowed as they reached the edge of the creek bed, now nothing more than a stretch of pale sand and scattered stone running east to west for nearly 2 miles. The horse did not hesitate. It stepped down the bank and crossed, hooves crunching softly over gravel, then climbed the opposite side with the confidence of memory. Clara felt her heartbeat steady into a rhythm that matched the animal's stride. This was no accident. This was a path once traveled often. On the far side of the creek, the land shifted subtly. The grass grew thinner. Fence posts leaned at tired angles. And then she saw it, the faint outline of a roof line against the brightening sky, half hidden by scrub and thyme. The Harper house had not burned to the ground as rumor once claimed. It stood, weathered in gray, windows dark, porch sagging but still upright. The gelding stopped at the edge of what had once been a front yard and lowered its head as if it had finally arrived. Clara released the rope and took a step forward on her own, the boards beneath her boots creaking in protest as she climbed onto the porch. The front door hung slightly open, not broken, just unlatched, swaying with each breath of wind. Inside, dust motes drifted in narrow beams of sunlight that slipped through cracks in the shutters. A table remained near the window. A chair tipped on its side. Nothing overturned in haste. Nothing torn apart. It looked less like a place abandoned and more like a place paused, as if the family who lived there had meant to return before supper and simply never did. Clara stepped across the threshold and felt the weight of years press gently against her shoulders. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat a single framed photograph, its glass clouded but unbroken. She lifted it carefully and brushed the surface with her sleeve until the faces came into view. Elias Harper stood in the center, younger than she remembered, one arm resting protectively around a woman with kind eyes. Between them stood a small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, holding the reins of this very same bay gelding. Clara's breath caught not from shock, but from recognition. The horse had not wandered into her pasture. It had led her home to a story that Red Hollow had chosen to forget, and in the stillness of that dusty room, she understood that forgetting and truth were rarely the same thing. Clara stood in the quiet of the Harper living room with the photograph still in her hands and felt the weight of something heavier than dust settle over her thoughts. The boy in the picture had his father's steady eyes and his mother's calm posture, one small hand wrapped confidently around the reins of the bay gelding, as if he had always known the animal would carry him somewhere important. The frame trembled slightly as she lowered it back onto the mantel, not from fear, but from the realization that the past had not disappeared the way Red Hollow preferred to believe. It had simply been set aside. She moved slowly through the house, her boots pressing into a thin layer of dirt that had gathered over the years. In the kitchen, tin plates remained stacked neatly on a shelf. A cast-iron skillet hung by the stove. A flour sack, long empty, lay folded on the counter. There were no signs of panic, no signs of haste. Only the careful order of a family that had expected to return before nightfall. Clara paused near a narrow hallway that led toward what must have been the bedrooms. The air inside carried a faint scent of cedar and old paper. She pushed open the first door and found a small room with a simple wooden bed, a patchwork quilt faded but intact, and on the far wall a line of pencil marks tracking a child's height year by year. The last mark stopped just above 4 feet tall. Beside it, written in careful script, were the initials SH and a date from 12 years ago. Clara traced the carved letters lightly with her fingertip and felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with recognition. Samuel Harper had not vanished into thin air. He had existed long enough to grow, to measure himself against a doorway, to hold the reins of a horse that now stood patiently outside. A soft thud from the porch drew her back toward the front of the house. She stepped outside to find the gelding standing near the broken fence post, nudging at the grass as though it remembered this yard in another season. Clara looked beyond the pasture and noticed something she had not seen before, a narrow line cut through the tall weeds leading east along the ridge. It was faint but deliberate, the kind of path made by someone who traveled it more than once. The horse lifted its head and turned in that direction, ears pricked forward. Clara followed its gaze and felt the story shift again beneath her feet. If the house had been left waiting, then someone had continued walking. Someone had not given up on the land entirely. She stepped off the porch and approached the fence line, brushing her hand along the weathered wood. The nails were rusted but not entirely loose. The hinges still held. Nothing here had collapsed beyond repair. It was as if the property had been frozen in time, suspended between accusation and return. Clara thought of Red Hollow and the way conversations had gone silent whenever the Harper name surfaced. She remembered the courthouse ledger, the way deeds could be altered with a pen stroke and a nod. The path along the ridge shimmered in the late morning sun, and the gelding gave a low, steady breath that sounded almost like encouragement. Clara gathered the lead rope once more and stepped toward that faint trail, aware that each stride carried her farther from the comfort of forgetting and closer to whatever truth had been left behind to find. The trail along the ridge was narrower than it had first appeared, pressed into the earth by careful footsteps rather than hooves, and Clara felt the difference immediately beneath her boots. The soil there was lighter, dust rising in thin spirals with each step as the late morning sun climbed past 60 degrees and began to dry the last of the dew from the grass. The gelding walked beside her now instead of ahead, its shoulder nearly brushing her arm, as if whatever it had needed to show her at the house had already been done. Ahead, the ridge curved gently east toward a stand of cottonwood trees that marked the only reliable spring within 5 miles. Few people visited it anymore. Red Hollow had dug wells closer to town, and convenience had a way of rewriting geography. Clara shaded her eyes with her hand and studied the distant trees. Between their pale trunks, she caught the faint glint of something unnatural, a straight line where only branches should have been. A roof edge, small, low to the ground. Not the Harper house, but something built later, built quietly. The realization slowed her steps. Someone had not only walked away from the old home. Someone had chosen to remain nearby without being seen. As she approached the cottonwoods, the air shifted cooler in their shade, the scent of damp earth replacing the dry bitterness of open prairie. The spring still trickled through a narrow bed of stone, clear water moving steadily despite the long summers that tested every other source. And there, tucked just beyond the tree line, stood a modest cabin no larger than 12 by 14 feet, its walls made from mismatched boards, its chimney patched with care rather than wealth. Smoke did not rise from it now, but the ground outside bore recent tracks, smaller than a man's boot, lighter than hers. Clara felt her pulse steady rather than quicken. This was not the edge of danger. It was the edge of an explanation. The gelding let out a low breath and stepped forward on its own, stopping several yards from the cabin door. Clara did not call out at first. She listened. The wind moved softly through the leaves, and from inside the cabin came the faint scrape of a chair against wood. Not hurried, not alarmed, simply present. She cleared her throat gently and spoke in a voice that carried without sharpness. "I am not here to take anything." The words hung in the shaded air. After a moment, the cabin door opened a few inches, then wider. A boy stepped into the light, perhaps 12 years old now, taller than the marks carved into the bedroom doorway had once promised. His hair was sun-streaked, his shirt clean but patched at the elbow, and his gaze moved first to the horse before it settled on Clara. There was no fear in his expression, only caution shaped by long habit. He placed one hand on the doorframe, as if measuring his balance between inside and out. The gelding shifted its weight and gave a soft nicker that seemed almost familiar. The boy's face changed at that sound, something gentle passing across it like recognition carried on memory. Clara saw it clearly then, the resemblance she had glimpsed in the photograph, the same steady eyes that had once belonged to a man who believed land should be earned, not quietly reassigned. The boy did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, at the rope in her hand, at the horse that had once stood in a different yard, and in that silent exchange Clara understood that the truth Red Hollow had buried was not gone. It had been growing quietly, one careful year at a time, beside a spring that never ran dry. The boy kept his hand on the doorframe as though the wood itself were steadying him, and for a long moment neither he nor Clara spoke. The cottonwood leaves whispered above them, and the spring moved in its quiet, faithful rhythm beside the cabin. The gelding took a single step forward and lowered its head, stretching its nose toward the boy's shoulder. The boy hesitated only a second before lifting his hand and resting it against the horse's face with a familiarity that did not need explanation. "You brought him back," he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of something older than his years. Clara shook her head slowly. "He found me," she replied, keeping her tone even. The boy studied her as if measuring whether she carried accusation or kindness. Finding neither, he stepped fully outside and let the cabin door rest open behind him. Up close, Clara could see that he was taller than she at first thought, perhaps 5 feet even now, his posture straight, his expression careful. He did not look like a child lost in the wilderness. He looked like someone who had learned to stay out of sight. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, offering the truth plainly. The boy nodded once. "Samuel Harper." He did not say it with defiance. He said it as fact. The name settled into the space between them, no longer a rumor carried through town but a living presence standing under the cottonwoods. Clara let the silence stretch just long enough to show respect. "Your father built the house by the creek," she said gently. Samuel's gaze flickered toward the ridge behind her. "We left it," he answered. "It was easier that way." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet understanding that decisions had been made long before he could question them. Clara glanced toward the cabin, noticing the small stack of chopped wood beside the wall, the neat rows of jars on a shelf visible through the open door, the careful order of a life managed with intention. "You have been here alone?" she asked. Samuel shook his head slightly. "Not always." He paused, as if choosing which parts of the story were safe to share. "My mother stayed until last winter. She said the land remembers who tends it. She said one day someone would come who still remembered us too." The words struck Clara with a softness sharper than any accusation. She thought of the photograph on the mantel, of the height marks carved into a doorway, of the way Red Hollow had closed ranks around a narrative that required fewer questions. "Your father," she began carefully. "Did he ever speak of returning?" Samuel's hand remained on the horse's neck, fingers threading lightly through its mane. "He said the truth does not hurry," he replied. "It waits until someone is willing to carry it." Clara felt the weight of that sentence settle over her shoulders like a coat she had not realized she was meant to wear. The gelding lifted its head and looked between them, as if the task that had begun at dawn was only halfway done. Clara met Samuel's steady gaze and understood that the story she had stepped into was not about what had been lost, but about what had quietly endured, waiting at the edge of town for someone brave enough to stop pretending it had never existed. Clara did not answer Samuel right away because some truths needed room before they could be carried. The wind shifted through the cottonwoods, stirring the leaves in a low silver murmur, and somewhere beyond the ridge a hawk circled in the widening blue of late morning. The sun had climbed high enough to cast short shadows now, the air edging closer to 70 degrees, warm but not yet heavy. Clara let her gaze move past the boy to the cabin behind him, to the stacked wood cut clean and even, to the water bucket resting full beside the door. This was not the work of neglect. This was the work of patience. "Your mother," she said gently. "Where is she now?" Samuel lowered his eyes for a moment, not in shame, but in respect. "She passed when the cold came early," he said. "She told me to stay. She said leaving twice would mean we never truly belonged." The words carried no anger, only a kind of steady loyalty that felt older than the boy speaking them. Clara nodded once. She understood that kind of loyalty. It was the same force that had kept her on her own patch of land after her husband's passing, even when the fields yielded little and the nights grew long. "Does anyone in town know you are here?" she asked. Samuel looked toward Red Hollow, though it was miles away and hidden by the rise of the ridge. "They know enough not to look," he replied. That answer settled heavily in the space between them. Clara thought of the courthouse ledger, of the careful handwriting that could add or erase a name with equal neatness. She thought of how easily a narrative could be shaped when a family was not present to speak for itself. The gelding shifted again and pressed its nose lightly against Samuel's shoulder, as if reminding him that he was not standing alone. Clara stepped closer, reducing the distance between them to only a few feet. "Your father was not what they said," she told him quietly. Samuel met her eyes without hesitation. "I know," he answered. There was no doubt in his voice, only certainty passed down through years of quiet explanation beside a spring that never stopped running. Clara drew a slow breath and felt the decision forming before she gave it words. "The house by the creek still stands," she said. "It is worn, but it is yours. The land remembers who tended it. So do I." Samuel studied her face carefully, searching for something that might betray pity or condescension. He found neither. "Why now?" he asked. It was a fair question. Clara looked toward the horse, then back at the boy. "Because the truth waited," she said, "and it came to my door. This morning." Samuel's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something close to hope held carefully in both hands. The spring moved behind them, constant and clear, and Clara understood that what lay ahead would not be settled in a single conversation. It would require walking back into town, into rooms where silence had once been chosen over fairness. But standing there beneath the cottonwoods, she realized something simple and solid. Forgetting had taken 12 years, but remembering had begun in a single dawn, led by a horse that refused to let the past remain buried. Clara remained beneath the cottonwoods a moment longer, feeling the weight of what must come next settle into something steady rather than uncertain. The sun had begun its slow drift west, light filtering through the leaves in thin bands that moved across Samuel's shoulders and the gelding's back. Noon would pass soon, and with it the quiet protection of distance. Red Hollow would wake fully by mid-afternoon. Wagons would creak along Main Street. The courthouse door would stand open. Conversations would begin and end in the same careful tones they always had. She knew that stepping back into town with this knowledge would not be simple, but she also knew silence had already done its damage. "You should not stay hidden," she said at last, her voice calm but firm. Samuel did not look away. "We were not hiding," he replied. "We were waiting." The distinction mattered. Clara nodded once in acknowledgement. Waiting required endurance. Hiding required fear. The boy before her did not carry fear in his posture. He carried resolve shaped quietly over years beside a spring that never betrayed him. The gelding shifted closer to Samuel, pressing its shoulder lightly against him, and Clara saw again the photograph in the old house, the small hand on the reins, the father standing tall behind his family. "Your land is still recorded," she said carefully. "Ink fades slower than memory." Samuel tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Then why did no one come?" he asked. Clara felt the truth rise in her throat, simple and unadorned. "Because it was easier not to," she answered. The breeze moved between them, lifting the edge of Samuel's shirt and stirring the dust at their feet. For a moment, neither spoke. The decision forming between them did not require persuasion. It required courage measured in steady steps. Clara reached into the pocket of her skirt and drew out a small leather pouch she used for carrying spare stitching needles. Inside it, folded carefully, was a scrap of paper she had taken from the Harper house earlier that morning, a tax notice dated 12 years ago with Elias Harper's name written clearly across the top. She held it out to Samuel. "Proof does not shout," she said quietly. "It stands." Samuel accepted the paper with careful hands, smoothing its creases with his thumb as though recognizing the shape of his father's name. His expression did not break into relief or triumph. It settled into something steadier. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. The question was not childish. It was measured. Clara looked toward the ridge, toward the faint path leading back to the Creek house, and beyond that to the town that had chosen convenience over fairness. She understood that the next steps would not bring noise or spectacle. They would bring conversation held in rooms where eyes avoided one another. But she also understood something else. The land north of the creek had not vanished. The cabin by the spring had not collapsed. The boy standing before her had not surrendered his name. "Yes," she said simply. The gelding lifted its head as if sensing the shift, and together they turned toward the ridge, three figures moving in quiet alignment beneath a wide Texas sky, carrying nothing louder than a folded paper and a truth that had waited long enough. They crossed the dry creek bed in the long stretch of early afternoon, the sun leaning westward and casting pale gold over the stones. Clara walked on Samuel's left, the gelding on his right, the three of them moving in quiet rhythm as though this path had always been meant for their return. The Harper house stood waiting beyond the rise, its gray boards weathered but upright, the porch sagging only slightly under years of wind and neglect. Samuel slowed as they approached, his steps careful, not hesitant but reverent. He had not stood before this doorway in more than a decade, yet his gaze moved across the windows and roofline with recognition that no ledger could erase. The air hovered near 75 degrees now, warm enough to carry the scent of cedar and old dust from the open windows. Clara paused at the gate and let Samuel step ahead. He placed his hand against the porch post, fingers tracing the grain of wood as if greeting an old friend. The gelding gave a soft breath and nudged the fence rail, settling as though it too had returned to familiar ground. Samuel climbed the porch steps slowly, each board creaking under his weight, and stopped at the threshold. He did not rush inside. Instead, he looked back at Clara, not for permission, but for confirmation that this moment was real. She gave a single nod. That was enough. He stepped into the house, and the afternoon light followed him through the doorway, illuminating the dust that drifted like suspended memory. Clara entered after him and watched as his eyes moved from the table to the mantel to the small bedroom hallway where pencil marks still measured a child's growth. He approached the doorway and laid his palm beside the last carved line, now well below his shoulder. A quiet understanding passed across his face, not sorrow but acknowledgement of time endured. Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded tax notice once more. "This is where it begins," she said softly, with proof that was never erased. Samuel unfolded the paper carefully and placed it on the kitchen table, smoothing it flat beneath his hand. The gesture was simple, yet it felt ceremonial, as though he were placing a cornerstone rather than a document. Outside, the wind shifted and carried distant sounds from town, a faint wagon wheel, the distant bark of a dog, reminders that Red Hollow continued its routines unaware of what was being restored here. Samuel looked toward the window that faced south, toward the road leading back to town. "They will not welcome this," he said quietly. Clara's expression remained steady. "Welcome is not required," she answered. "Only truth." The words settled between them without force. Samuel drew a slow breath and straightened his shoulders. The house no longer seemed abandoned. It felt inhabited by resolve. The gelding moved closer to the porch, its shadow stretching long across the yard as the afternoon deepened. Clara stepped outside once more and looked across the acreage that had once been dismissed as empty. Fences could be mended. Fields could be turned again. Names could be spoken aloud. She turned back toward the doorway where Samuel now stood, framed by light and shadow, no longer hidden beneath cottonwoods, but visible in the open air of his own home. The return had begun quietly, without raised voices or spectacle, only steady steps across familiar ground. And in that stillness, the land itself seemed to recognize who had come back to claim it. By the time they reached the edge of Red Hollow, the sun had begun its slow descent, turning the wide Texas sky into layers of amber and pale rose. Clara walked beside Samuel along the main road, the dust rising softly around their boots with each step. The gelding followed just behind them, steady and unhurried, its presence drawing the first curious glances from men leaning against storefronts and women pausing in doorways. Red Hollow was not a large town, no more than a few dozen buildings stretched along a single broad street, but it held memory the way dry earth holds heat. Conversations quieted as they passed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to mark the shift. Samuel kept his chin level, his shoulders square, neither challenging nor shrinking from the stairs. He did not walk like a stranger. He walked like someone who knew the ground beneath his feet. Clara felt the weight of familiar eyes on her back. She had purchased feed here, mended harness straps here, exchanged polite greetings beneath the shade of the mercantile porch for years. Today the air felt different, heavier with recognition that had been postponed too long. They stopped first at the courthouse, a simple brick building with tall windows and a flag stirring faintly above the entrance. The wooden door stood open to the late afternoon breeze. Inside, the room smelled of paper and ink, shelves lined with ledgers that recorded births, marriages, property lines, and quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Samuel paused at the threshold but did not hesitate. Clara stepped in beside him. Behind the front desk sat Sheriff Dalton Graves, spectacles resting low on his nose as he scanned a column of figures. He looked up at the sound of their boots and held Clara's gaze a moment longer than necessary. Then his eyes shifted to Samuel. Recognition flickered there, subtle but unmistakable. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. The sheriff removed his spectacles slowly and folded them in his hand. "Afternoon," he said evenly. Clara placed the folded tax notice on the counter. Between them, the paper lay flat, unadorned, carrying only a name and a date. "This land north of the creek was never surrendered," she said calmly. "It was recorded. It was paid. It remains." Sheriff Graves glanced down at the document, then toward the shelves of bound ledgers behind him. The room felt smaller suddenly, as though the walls had leaned inward to listen. Samuel stood silent, his presence steady beside Clara's, neither demanding nor pleading. Outside, the faint sound of wagon wheels rolled past, ordinary life continuing within earshot of a quiet reckoning. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned and walked to the back shelf, fingers trailing across spines until he located a volume worn thin at the edges. He carried it back to the desk and opened it with careful hands. Pages rustled. Ink lines glimmered in the fading light. Clara watched his finger trace downward along a column until it stopped. He remained still for a long second. Then he nodded once, almost to himself. The record was never amended, he said quietly. He closed the ledger and looked at Samuel, not with accusation, not with apology, but with acknowledgement that the paper on the desk and the boy before him spoke the same truth. The silence that followed did not carry threat. It carried the slow turning of something long avoided. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Main Street, and within the courthouse walls a name that had once been spoken only in whispers now rested plainly on the page where it had always belonged. The ledger remained open on the desk between them, its pages catching the last light of day that filtered through the courthouse windows. Sheriff Dalton Graves rested his palm against the paper as though feeling the weight of ink pressed into fiber 12 years earlier. Outside, the sounds of Red Hollow drifted in through the open door, a distant laugh, the low murmur of conversation, boots scuffing against the boardwalk. Ordinary life, unaware that something long unsettled had just found its footing. Samuel stood straight beside Clara, his eyes steady, his breathing even. He did not look at the sheriff with expectation. He looked at him as one man looks at another when facts are already clear. Sheriff Graves closed the ledger carefully and removed the star-shaped badge pinned to his vest. He did not place it down in surrender, nor did he remove it in disgrace. He simply adjusted it and looked back at Samuel with a gaze that carried memory. "Your father came here," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not travel beyond the room. "He stood where you are standing now. He said the land was earned honest. I did not argue the record. I only allowed silence to speak louder." The words were not an excuse. They were a confession of omission. Clara felt the air shift, not tense but honest. Samuel did not raise his voice. "Silence can be corrected," he said. It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. The sheriff nodded once, then reached for a clean sheet of paper and dipped his pen into ink. The scratch of metal against fiber filled the room with a steady rhythm. He wrote deliberately, line by line, affirming what had never been erased. Ownership retained, taxes recorded, property unamended. When he finished, he sanded the page lightly and blew away the excess grains before pressing the official seal into warm wax at the bottom. The impression sat firm and unmistakable. He handed the document across the desk to Samuel without ceremony. "This stands," he said simply. Samuel accepted it with both hands, not smiling, not celebrating, only holding it with the quiet understanding that the weight of paper could restore what rumor had displaced. Clara glanced toward the courthouse door where several townsfolk now lingered in the fading light, curiosity pulling them closer without crossing the threshold. No one stepped inside. No one objected. The truth did not demand a spectacle. It required acknowledgement. Sheriff Graves turned toward the open doorway and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried just far enough to reach those waiting outside. "The Harperland remains Harperland." The statement fell into the evening air without flourish. There was no protest, only a gradual shift in posture among those listening, a collective adjustment of memory aligning with record. Samuel folded the document carefully and tucked it inside his shirt pocket, close against his chest. Clara stepped back toward the door, allowing him to walk out first. As they emerged onto Main Street, the sky burned deep orange above the rooftops, shadows stretching long across the dirt road. The gelding waited beside the hitching rail, calm and patient, as though it had known this hour would arrive. Samuel placed a hand against its neck and looked down the length of the street, not in defiance, but in belonging. No applause followed. No cheers rose. Only the steady hum of a town recalibrating itself around a truth that had never left the page. And in that quiet recalibration, Something older than pride took root, something steadier than reputation, something that did not require noise to be real. Night settled over Red Hollow without ceremony, the last streaks of orange fading into a deep indigo that wrapped the town in quiet reflection. Oil lamps flickered to life along Main Street, their glow soft against wooden storefronts that had witnessed more whispered judgments than open debates. Samuel walked beside Clara toward the hitching rail, the folded document resting secure against his chest, its presence less like a trophy and more like an anchor. The gelding lifted its head as they approached, ears forward, breath steady in the cooling air that had dropped back towards 60 degrees. A few townsfolk lingered beneath the awning of the mercantile, not confronting, not retreating, simply watching with expressions that carried the weight of reconsideration. Clara felt no triumph in their silence, only a subtle shift, like soil turning beneath a plow after a long drought. Samuel untied the reins and rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck, not in relief but in gratitude. He had not asked the town to apologize. He had not demanded acknowledgement beyond what was written. Yet something in the way he stood there, unshaken and unembellished, seemed to steady even those who had once chosen convenience over clarity. Sheriff Graves stepped out onto the courthouse porch, hat in hand, and remained there a moment before descending the steps. He approached without haste, boots measured against the wooden boards. "The record will be read again on Sunday," he said quietly, addressing no one and everyone at once. "So there is no confusion." His words were simple. No proclamation, no drama, just a correction spoken aloud. A murmur moved lightly through the small gathering, not resistance, not approval, but acceptance forming in the open air. Samuel looked down the length of Main Street, past the general store, past the feed supply, toward the road leading north. "I will begin repairs tomorrow," he said calmly. "The fences first." It was not a declaration of return. It was a plan. Clara nodded beside him. "I will bring tools," she added. The offer was practical, not performative. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant mesquite smoke as the town adjusted itself around the fact that a name once avoided had been spoken without fear. One by one, people drifted back to their routines. Doors closed softly. Lamps dimmed behind curtains. No confrontation followed. No raised voices cracked the night. Only the steady hum of a place relearning its own history. Samuel mounted the gelding with practiced ease, the animal shifting beneath him with familiarity that needed no rehearsal. Clara walked at his side as they turned toward the northern road, the moon rising pale above the ridge that led back to the creek. Their silhouettes stretched long behind them, not as fugitives or challengers, but as rightful stewards moving toward land that had waited. The town remained quiet, yet it no longer felt guarded. It felt thoughtful, and as the hoofbeats faded into the cool Texas night, the silence left behind was no longer avoidance. It was the sound of a community choosing, at last, to let truth stand where it had always belonged. Morning returned to the Harper land with a pale blue sky and a thin veil of mist rising from the creek bed. The air held a quiet chill, just under 55 degrees, the kind that sharpened breath and made each movement deliberate. Samuel was already awake when Clara arrived with a wagon carrying fence posts, wire, and a box of tools worn smooth by years of use. The gelding stood near the pasture edge, grazing calmly as if it had never left this ground. The house looked different in the early light, not restored, not repaired, but claimed. Samuel stepped down from the porch with sleeves rolled and determination set quietly in his posture. He did not greet the morning with ceremony. He greeted it with work. Clara handed him a hammer without words, and together they walked the length of the broken fence line. Each post they drove into the earth felt less like construction and more like affirmation. The sound of iron striking wood carried across the acreage in steady rhythm, not loud enough to disturb, but firm enough to be heard by anyone who cared to listen. By mid-morning, the temperature climbed into the low 70s, and the sun warmed their backs as they tightened wire and set new rails upright. Dust clung to their boots. Sweat traced faint lines along Samuel's temples. Yet there was no complaint in his expression, only focus. Around noon, a wagon appeared at the crest of the ridge. Clara paused, shading her eyes. It was old Mr. Bennett from the southern pasture, his beard white as chalk and his hat tilted against the glare. He drove slowly, stopping at the fence line with a nod that carried more meaning than any speech. Heard the record was read, he said simply. Samuel set down the pliers and approached without hesitation. Mr. Bennet reached into his wagon and handed him a small sack of seed corn. Good land deserves planting, he added. There was no apology attached, no explanation for past silence. Just a gesture placed plainly in the open air. Samuel accepted the sack with both hands. Thank you, he replied. The words were steady and unadorned. Before long, another figure appeared along the ridge path, then another. A woman from town brought a basket of nails. A ranch hand offered spare lumber. No one spoke of the years lost. They spoke only of weather, of soil, of practical matters that build rather than divide. Clara watched the quiet procession with a measured calm. This was not redemption shouted across a square. It was acknowledgement delivered in small, deliberate acts. By late afternoon, nearly half the fence stood firm again, stretching straight across the pasture where it had once leaned in defeat. Samuel walked its length, testing each post with a firm grip, ensuring its hold. The land felt different underfoot, as though it recognized the weight of rightful steps. As the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the field, Samuel turned toward the house, the seed corn still resting against his side. Clara stood near the gate, her hands resting on the top rail. Neither spoke of victory. Neither claimed change. Yet in the steady lines of new fence and the quiet presence of neighbors who had chosen to show up rather than turn away, something unmistakable had taken root. Not loud, not dramatic, just firm. And as the evening breeze moved gently across the restored boundary, it carried with it the simple truth that justice had arrived not by force, but by hands willing to rebuild what should never have been abandoned. Spring came slowly to the land north of the creek, not in a single bright bloom, but in quiet changes that revealed themselves to those who paid attention. The mornings grew softer, the air resting near 60 degrees before sunrise, carrying the scent of turned soil and new grass pushing up between the fence posts Samuel had set with his own hands. The seed corn Mr. Bennet had offered now broke through the earth in neat green rows, fragile but certain, stretching across the field where dust had once gathered untouched. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture one evening as the sky shifted from gold to lavender, watching Samuel walk the perimeter of the property with the easy stride of someone who no longer measured his steps against doubt. The house by the creek no longer felt paused in time. Its windows were clean. Smoke curled lightly from the chimney at dusk. The porch boards had been reinforced, not replaced, honoring what had endured rather than pretending it had not weathered hardship. The gelding grazed near the fence line, lifting its head now and then as if keeping quiet watch over a promise fulfilled. Red Hollow had adjusted in its own steady way. On Sundays, when the courthouse doors opened and records were read aloud, the Harper name was spoken without hesitation. No one flinched. No one whispered. It was simply part of the town's history, as it had always been. Sheriff Dalton Graves kept his posture the same as ever, but there was a different cadence in his voice when he spoke of property lines and recorded deeds, a clarity shaped by the understanding that silence carried weight too. Samuel did not boast of what had been restored. He did not recount the years spent beside the spring. He planted, repaired, and greeted neighbors with the same calm respect he had shown on the day he walked into town. Some evenings, a wagon would stop by with spare nails or a jar of preserves. Other nights, the land rested in complete stillness, the only sound the wind moving gently through mesquite and cottonwood leaves. Clara visited often, not as a guardian, but as a friend. She would sit on the porch with a tin cup warming her hands and listen to the rhythm of work being done without spectacle. She had not set out to change a town. She had followed a horse at dawn and chosen not to turn back. That was all. Yet sometimes that was enough. One evening, as the sun lowered beyond the ridge and shadows stretched long across the newly planted field, Samuel stood beside the fence and looked out over the acreage. The rows were straight. The posts were firm. The house stood quiet and strong against the fading light. He did not smile broadly. He did not raise his voice. He simply rested his hand against the top rail and breathed in the scent of his own land. Clara watched from a short distance, understanding that belonging did not announce itself with noise. It settled in the chest like steady breath after a long walk. The wind moved softly across the pasture, carrying no accusation, no regret, only the calm assurance that what was earned honestly could be restored honestly. And as the last light slipped beneath the horizon, the land lay quiet and whole, not because someone fought for it, but because someone chose to stand for it and never step aside.